Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's late at night, perhaps not easy for you to concentrate, having had to attend many lectures of great value throughout the day. But it's the time that has been allotted for me to speak to you tonight, and so I do. It's a great pleasure to be able to accept the invitation of this group after several years when I could not come. And I pray that they will have the greatest success in this very difficult moment of the history of Muslim peoples and of the world to disseminate the authentic knowledge of Islam and things Islamic. I've been asked to speak this evening about the issue of man, nature, and the environmental crisis, especially from the Islamic point of view. The subject with which I've been concerned since my undergraduate years at MIT studying physics, which is a long, long time ago, it seems like centuries ago. And I've been involved in all the different movements during the last 50 years of what is called the environmental crisis. And I'm both sad as a Muslim and happy. Sad that the Islamic world turned its attention to this matter so late, and happy that finally, at least in some areas, some corners of the Islamic world, and among the intelligentsia of Muslims outside of the Islamic world, fortunately some people now are paying attention to this matter. Let me say at the outset, not to be fooled by what one hears by politicians on radio and television, that as soon as there's an economic shortage, the environment is of no consequence. Global warming is just a dream. The pollution of our waters and our rivers, our mountains and our air is simply the work of a few leftists who do not know what is really going on, and that what is important is jobs. This is all totally fallacious, based upon a suicidal view of the nature of human existence on this earth. The relation between man and nature is in a very profound crisis. The crisis is universal in the sense that no one can evade it. When pollutants enter the air in New York, they land in Morocco. And when radioactivity begins in Japan, gradually its effects are seen in Indonesia, as we see right before our eyes these days after the tsunami. So it's a universal matter in the sense that even those who were totally innocent and had nothing to do with the destruction of the environment, which is the result of the industrialization process and the rise of the modern world, and which cannot be put at the feet of traditional religions, as some have tried to do. Even those who are totally innocent suffer for it as much as those who have the greatest share in destroying the great creation that God has given us, expecting us to be its custodians. And also this issue is of the greatest urgency. We talk about a lot of things, and usually in the 10th or 11th line of our concerns comes the concern for the environment. I have occasion oftentimes to speak to audiences, Muslim and non-Muslim throughout the world. They ask me to speak on philosophy, on the Sharia, on mysticism, on this and that. The ordinary concern of most human beings is not as yet attuned to what is really most essential, namely the condition of our life on earth and how we're going to survive as human beings. This is one of the great tragedies of our world. That is, there are certain forces, because of its short-sightedness, which try to prevent us from understanding the urgency, not only universality, but the urgency of the environmental crisis. It's more important than anything else, including the economic crisis that is now affecting the world, and which is very much, in fact, related deeper down to what we have done to nature and continue to do in the name of economic progress. That God of Shaitan, which was born in the 19th century and is still somewhat with us. Now, very quickly, it's important for especially a Muslim audience like this to remember that we don't have to learn everything from the West. We don't have to wait until somebody in the West says there's an environmental crisis to say, oh yes, there's an environmental crisis because some Englishman or American or Frenchman said so. We have to get to a point where we can see things for ourselves that we have done through most of our illustrious history and not be in this state of inferiority complex in which we find ourselves. The environmental crisis is a very good case at point. The awareness of the environmental crisis began within the 1950s. It began with what appeared to be an innocent book by an American naturalist who used to wander around in the beautiful woods that they have still surviving in the United States. It's very interesting that after the Europeans invaded the United States, for 40,000 years, the natives of North America had kept the American continent so beautiful that where they lived are now national parks for white men and women, which is a very interesting point to consider, how different they lived in relation to nature. And we was wondering and seeing all the streams being polluted. A woman called Rachel Carson wrote Silent Springs. And that was followed shortly thereafter, and this makes me very sad, by my own book, Man and Nature, which was a Rockefeller Series lecture I delivered at the University of Chicago in the 1960s, and which was the most disregard of all my books in the Islamic world for decades, until it was translated to Turkish, and now it's in all the different Islamic languages. And this goes to show you that even for yours truly, who was living at that time in Iran and who wrote a great deal, his writings were read oftentimes in other countries, is one thing that nobody was really very much interested in the Islamic world. And a lot of effort since then has been used in the West to create the awareness of the environmental crisis. This is in certain circles, but not in others, as I mentioned. And in the last 2 decades, somewhat in the Islamic world, at least in certain places. But as we see, things go on as usual. And the reason is that the environmental crisis is not going to be over unless there is a profound paradigm shift of what modern man considers himself and the world to be. It means a death to what we think we are and a birth to what we really are. And that is a very difficult thing to do, and that is why every resistance is met at a time when many people in the West are thinking what to do. The Islamic world, most of the Islamic world, along with much of the rest of the non-Western world, including the Hindu world and the Buddhist world, are making the same mistakes which brought about the environmental crisis in the West to start with the result that today a city like Toronto is probably less polluted than Cairo or Tehran. That's not to say much, but at least that's the reason for it. But I want, instead of just discussing the international and global consequence of the environmental crisis, turn specifically to the Islamic world. First of all, the Islamic world is heir to a civilization which produced one of the greatest scientific traditions in world history. That is, which had a very long tradition of dealing with the world of nature in a rational and scientific way. It cannot therefore be compared to some primal societies where there's the excuse that people didn't have any science or anything like that. And in fact, they clung to something more profound, but I will not get into that. The Islamic world is one which produced a great deal of science. It produced the first major sedentary populations in the world. It is said that the first city in the world which had 1 million people in it was not in China, but in Khorasan, my own home country, in Iran, the city of Nishabur. And this is quite remarkable, that Islamic civilization was used to sedentary life. Before the modern world, although it had, of course, a nomadic population. It had a major intellectual tradition. It had people who wrote philosophically, scientifically, mystically, legally, juridically about the status of nature and human beings' relationship to it. Why is it then that there was this delayed reaction? Why is it then when even after my book on Rachel Carson came out, In 1984, when the Club of Rome report came out on limits to growth, which bothered a lot of people in the West, because the West identified civilization with growth, this word which is used every other sentence by politicians of any party that wants to get elected in the West. Growth, development, all of these words which are extremely dangerous words in the present context. They're much more dangerous than arsenic, if you really realize what is meant, what is the implication of these words. Why is it that the Islamic world paid no attention? I was in Tehran when the Club of Rome the first report came out, and how unhappy the people who were running the country were, because they, like those in other Islamic countries, their program was essentially modernization. And to modernize, one could not be bothered with any obstacle on the path to modernization. And so this long hiatus of delay. It's very, very interesting that for a long, long time in the Islamic world, whatever form of government existed, whether it were a revolutionary republic or a monarchy or Islamic government or lay government, all the way from the Islamic Republic of Iran to the Saudi monarchy to Gaddafi's Libya before it was destroyed, they shared one thing in common, one thing all in common, namely total indifference to the importance of what they were doing to the natural environment. I always say jokingly, don't say that the Islamic world is not united. The Islamic world is united in one thing, and that's in destruction of nature. Perfect unity in this matter. Alas, that it is in destruction not only of God's creation, but ultimately of ourselves. Especially that since most of the Islamic world lives in areas which are ecologically very sensitive. They're brittle, where there's not much water, where plants are very, very important, where deforestation is much more effective than in the middle of Siberia or in Norway. And nevertheless, we see before us what is taking place. Look at the contrast. Look at the contrast between traditional Islamic cities, towns and villages, and present-day Islamic cities, towns and villages. There are no traditional Islamic cities left completely, but only partially. Cities such as Fez, the old part of Sana'a, old part of cities like Yazd and Isfahan, some other Persian cities, there's still something left of the old sedentary structures. We can still see what it looked like, what it was. But there are a lot of traditional towns, and especially smaller villages, that have not been totally destroyed. They were all based on a harmony between themselves and the natural environment. The city of New York could not survive 5,000 years, not even 500 years, in equilibrium with the environment around it, even 50 years, without external elements being inoculated into its veins all the time. Whereas an Afghan village before the tragedies that befell Afghanistan could have survived another 50,000 years without any further disequilibrium with the environment around it. All traditional Islamic cities were built in remarkable equilibrium with their environment. The use of water, the use of air, the use of space, the use of light. They still survive in small units. Look at the Sultan Hassan Mosque in Cairo. Look at some of the mosques in Isfahan. How air is circulated, or the so-called badgirs, the wind catchers we have in southern Persia and in the Persian Gulf, and many of the Arab Emirates that have copied it. The air is caught and brought into the building and out. And how ecologically sane these structures were. They did not try to, on purpose, oppose nature, like these glass boxes in which we live, which have to use the maximum energy in the summer to cool off and in the winter to heat up. Totally opposed to the harmony that existed traditionally in the Islamic world between even the sedentary populations and the sedentary structures and the world of nature. The last word has not as yet been said about this, and a lot more study has to be made. There are a number of architects in the Islamic world, going back to the great Egyptian architect Hassan Fatih, and some of his students like Abdul Wahid al-Bakir, Omar Farouk, others, the great architects, Egyptian architects, who were trying to recreate that traditional village and town structure which was in harmony with the natural world. But now that we see a 100-story building next to the Sea of Mecca, what can one say? Where are we going? Where are we going? As a Muslim, nothing in the world, Mala Malayaf, is so sad. A building that by its very presence is in opposition to the laws of God's creation, if you only paid attention to it. And this is only one instance among many. Now, in order to understand what has happened, let me just go back a little bit religiously and philosophically and remind ourselves of this fact that the Islamic world throughout its history survived through a harmony between the sedentary and the nomadic people. The nomads were always the preservers of nature, and it's they who rejuvenated the life of the sedentary people and prevented sedentary expansion to become urban sprawl as we have in the modern world. The fact that the Cairo of today and the Mamluk Cairo are very different was partly due, not completely, but partly due to the presence of the nomadic elements which control the deserts, and more than Egypt in North Africa, where they still survive, and in Persia and Central Asia and many, many other places. This takes us back to the story which is in the Bible, and we have it also in Islamic sources, of course, the story of Cain and Abel, Habil and Qabil. One brother is the father of the sedentary people, and the other is the father of nomadic people. And finally, he who is the father of the sedentary people kills his brother, who symbolizes the nomadic people, which means that ultimately the sedentary people destroy the nomadic people. And that's exactly what we see before our eyes. And the destruction of the nomadic element in the Islamic world has a lot to do with the destruction of the environment. And we see it right before our eyes in countries like Arabia, where the nomadic element was settled only 30, 40 years ago, and in other places, in Iran, in North Africa, and other places. It's a very, very important story to remember. In a sense, God foresaw what would happen in the history of the humanity that He had created. But He had also given us the instructions to be able not to destroy the earth. I believe that the ishara, the indication, the Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2 of the Quran, which refers to those who corrupt the earth, al-mufsiduna fil ard, which historically has usually been taken for oppressors or people who use too much interest in or usury and this kind of thing, has a much more profound significance for us today. And that is those who destroy the earth by polluting it. Those who bring about fasad, not only by making money and killing people, but by killing nature itself. The harm that they do is 1,000 times worse than what the most oppressor in human history did, than all the heads that Tamerlane cut off and made minarets out of it when he attacked Samarkand, from Samarkand attacked Kerman or other places. All of the cruelties, even the cruelty of the Mongols, is nothing compared to the facade that we are creating on the earth. I mean, this Quranic lesson, al-mufsiduna fil ard, must be understood by us Muslims as also a message from God, not to be a mufsid. Mufsid is not only a person who does not eat up the money of the yatim, of the orphan, and does not do wrong things economically. It's also one who respects the huquq, the duty, rights of God's creation. Everything according to Islam has its huquq, has its rights. Everything, of course, the highest being God's rights, huquq Allah, but every creature has its own rights, which we have no right to destroy. And true taqwa and not committing fasad is precisely to observe the rights of all creatures, not only human beings. We're not the only creatures on earth. And this brings me up to a very important point, which a lot of modern Islamic thought has neglected. Mesmerized by Western thinking, by the materialism that's prevalent in the West, by modern science, which has now become a second god for Muslims who say La ilaha illallah, but they really are worshiping modern science and scientism, which has crept into the Islamic world, into every form of government, from my own country, Iran, to Pakistan, to Egypt. All these incredible books coming out showing this verse of the Quran proves quantum mechanics, this other verse proves what Pastor said about germs. It's total nonsense, total nonsense, because science changes all the time. And the Quran is the word of God that does not change. In this atmosphere, something very, very important has been forgotten. And what has been forgotten is that the Quran was not only revealed to men and even only to men and jinn, but to all of creation. The Quran addresses creation. God takes creatures, even Tina wa Zaytun, an olive, as witness. What does it mean that God takes an olive as witness? We don't think olive has a consciousness. We live in a world in which consciousness and life have been taken away from creation by modern science. And so we're all hypocrites in a certain sense if we accept that worldview. The Quran has another view of nature. Everything is alive. Everything is God's witness. It's true that the sun and the moon revolve around in the heavens, and you can calculate their orbit mathematically. But the Quran says about Shamsu wal Qamaru yasjudan. If you do not see that movement as sujood, then we're not really Muslims seriously. And we're faced with this great crisis. But the Quran contains a complete cosmology, a philosophy of nature, in which nature participates not only in our life, not only serves us, but also participates in our spiritual life. And elements of nature will be witness and testify against us on the day of judgment. We know that. We know that from the Quran, from the Hadith, that all of our jawarih, all of our organs, will, independently of our consciousness and our will, testify as to what we did on the day of judgment. If we are good Muslims, we believe in Islam. There's so many hadiths and ayahs of the Quran that it's very hard to reject that and say, oh, all of this is just metaphorical. I'm not one of those people who accept this metaphoricalness. I believe in the symbolic aspect of the Quran, but not as metaphorical. These are truths which are very, very significant. And all of nature is alive. I can never refrain from quoting one of the most beautiful poems in all Islamic literature, the little knowledge that I have, a poem by Jalaluddin Rumi that says, I shall quote it for you in Persian. I'm a Persian, I cannot speak without at least quoting one Persian poem. He says, Kashki hasti zabani dashti, taz serha pardaha bardashti. If only the world of existence had tongues, then it could lift the veil from all the mysteries of God. This is the Islamic understanding of nature. This is what we have to resuscitate and revive, never forgetting that not only the verses of the Quran, but the phenomena of nature are called ayat. Not only phenomena of nature, but the phenomena within our soul. So the Quran says, "Sanurihum ayatina fil afaqi wa fi anfusihim." We shall show them the ayat, the signs of God upon the horizons and within ourselves, until it becomes revealed unto them annahu al-haq, that is the truth. So we have three ayat, the verse of the Quran, the phenomena of nature, and our inner reality. And we must always be aware of this triangle, all of which is created by God, all of which is interrelated. The Quran is not only the source of a legal aspect of human life, of course it is. It is not only the source of our ethics, of course it is. But most of all, and is the source of the knowledge of reality. The Quran is a book about the nature of reality, with the capital R, which is God, Allah Ta'ala, and higher, lower levels of reality which God has created, and therefore the message of the world of nature. Furthermore, the Quran has taught us in several instances that we are God's Khalifatullah. إِنَّا جَعَلْنَا فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. And of course referring to Sayyidina Dawood alayhi salam, but it refers to all human beings. We are the Khalifa of God. What does it mean to be the Khalifa of God? The vicegerent of God. A Khalifa is a person who performs certain functions in place of the person for whom he is the Khalifa, obviously. Now, God was the creator of the world. We cannot be Khalifatullah, we don't have the power of creation. So we're not Khalifatullah as Al-Khaliq. But no, God is not only creator of the world, He's also sustainer of the world. He's the protector of things. He's Hafiz or Muhafiz. And He's also ala kulli shayn muhit. He encompasses all things. His presence is everywhere. As Khalifatullah, our duty is not only to conquer nature and destroy it. Everybody talks to the Muslim modernists about taskhir, conquering nature. God allows us to perform dominion over nature, provided we remember it by Khalifatullah. God also has dominion over nature, but He also protects nature. He protects the life of the little ant. If God acted with nature the way we've been doing for the past 200 years, there would be no world around for our children to live in. It's as simple as that. It's remarkable how God protects His own creation. And so the function of protector is a function that we have as God, Khalifatullah. One of the functions that we have. And the protection of nature is therefore a religious duty. And this brings me up to a very important issue. The Sharia, the divine law of Islam. Of course, much of it is concerned with transactions, with relation with human beings. Much of it is concerned with worship, with ibadat. But in both the ibadat and the mu'amalat, the two parts of the Sharia, which are the fundamental parts of dividing the Sharia all together, it's one, of course. There are references not only to the human state, but to the non-human. The pollution of running water is a sin. It's not only a bad act from the environment, it's a sin according to Islamic law. Cutting a fruit tree, the Prophet forbade it when he was alive, and during several of the maghazi. And there were very, very clear indications that a Muslim should not cut fruit trees. That's why in Medina, when land got expensive, and some of the Saudis wanted to sell their land, they were not allowed to cut the old, beautiful palm trees, some of which had been planted by Sayyidina Ali, they say. So they let them die out by not watering them. An intermediate stage occurred in Medina a few years ago when all the beautiful gardens were just columns of dry palms. But the Sharia reason was that you were forbidden to cut the trees, so they killed it another way. That's something else. But to not kill the tree, not to kill other animals without reason. There are all kinds of injunctions. Even the creation of what now we call national parks, the hibah that the Prophet ordered to be created around the area of Mecca and Medina, in which even wildlife were not to be molested. These all existed according to the Sharia. The Sharia is not only for Islamic society of human beings. It's for not only human beings, for all the creatures around human beings. It's an Islamic society in which the Sharia is really promulgated. Not only involves your relation to your wife and your neighbor and your father and your mother and in the bazaar, it also involves your relationship with your cow and your horse and your tree and the street and the air you breathe and the water you drink and so forth and so on. So those of us who keep talking about the Sharia and then go destroying God's creation, What kind of hypocrisy is this? How are we going to answer God on the day of judgment? We must understand this. This is what God demands of us. And then, my time is running out. I'm one of those people who hates to be late. I try to be Muslim in every way except in being late. Parallel with the Sharia, traditional Islamic civilization created remarkable philosophies of nature, meaning of nature, how to deal with nature. This is something in which I have a little bit of expertise in. I'm supposed to know something about Islamic science. It's absolutely incredible how Islam develops a science that is science but on a basis of a philosophy of nature which is totally different from what there is today. Today, when you're a scientist, the hand of God is irrelevant. You may be personally a good Catholic or an atheist. It makes no difference whatsoever to your physics, to your chemistry. Whereas in Islam, the study of nature was always related to a philosophy of nature in which the role of God was central. And our role in relation to being God's Khalifa always was also very, very important. We have lost a great deal of our traditional architecture, of our city planning. We have lost a great deal of our traditional agriculture. And parallel with those practical things, we've lost a great deal of our knowledge, metaphysical and philosophical knowledge of nature, which really needs to be resuscitated. There is such a thing, an Islamic philosophy of the environment and ecology, and even Islamic economics, about which people speak so much today. Much of it is based on the false premise of accepting the modern technology and methods of production as being the only way of looking at the material world and trying to create an Islamic economics on the basis of that. That's what it ends only with the question of usury. Nothing else of significance is even discussed. But authentic Islamic economics does not separate itself from ecology. It's not like in the modern world. It's either economics or ecology, one or the other. Everybody talks about that. That is not at all the case. Let me finish by saying a few words about the future, since this is a conference which emphasizes that. I always say when I'm invited to lecture that I hate futurology. Fortunately, all futurologists have come out to be wrong. Future is in the hands of God. When you look at the book of Future Shock of Toffler, things like that, where are they? Those books that's sold by the millions. We should be humble before God's power. But nevertheless, God has given us intelligence to plan. He wants us to plan. And who's Ahsan al-Makirin. And He wants us also to plan, but He is the best of those who use both planning and makr and ruse to guide us. But I believe that if, inshallah, there will be a future, and I'm very hopeful for the Islamic world, there will be. I think we're going through a very, very difficult period. But in contrast to many people, if some cosmic event does not occur, I see much better days for the Islamic world. And the day of slavery of our governments to some foreign office is over. And sooner or later, that book will be closed. That book will be closed, inshallah. But there's a future. There are some things that we have to do. First of all, there's no way at all to think about the relationship between man and nature and an Islamic way of dealing with this relationship without a profound critique of Western science and technology and overcoming the scientism which, like cholera, has taken over much of the Islamic world. One has to be very brave to do this. Very, very brave, because one is attacked from the left and the right, the north and the south. One has a very strong backbone. When I first began to speak about Islamic science 50 years ago, I was very strongly criticized by all sides, from traditional ulama to modernized Muslim coming out of the Sorbonne. 50 years later, everybody talks about Islamic science. That one has to have the patience and the fortitude, but there needs to be an Islamic critique of modern science and technology's view of nature. Otherwise, everything else is just second-rate poetry, not even good poetry. In Arabic, and Persian, say shi'r, but shi'r is a very precious thing if it's good. Secondly, we need to reformulate in a language that our young can understand, those young people who are here and those who are not here, the Islamic teachings concerning nature. There are no literatures, I say in the plural, that are richer in the description of nature than classical Arabic and Persian poetry. Unfortunately, I don't know other Islamic languages well enough to know their poetry, but I know also in Turkish, Yunus Emre, the remarkable Turkish poet that wrote some of his poems, more recent in Urdu and Bengali, but certainly these two languages I know a little bit about, Persian and Arabic, remarkably rich. Our young need to read these poems, need to know them, their way through art to express the deepest relationship between the world of nature. We have to revive, although many people oppose me on this, Islamic science and technology. They say, how can we revive Islamic technology, just a horse drawing carriage or something like that? It's much more profound than that. Much more profound than that. There are many places, including agriculture, where Islamic technology can be revived, which can do a great deal of good. Irrigation, agriculture, many other things into which I will not go. And if we're going to ever adopt Western science, not as an alien cancer, but as a part of our body, we have to revive Islamic science as the foundation through which then to be able to integrate Western science, and not to simply produce Western scientists who have Muslim names. That's quite something else. They're not part of Islamic civilization. That's something else. We have to formulate not only an Islamic ethics of nature, but a metaphysics of nature. No ethics is actually ever effective without a view of the nature of reality, which means metaphysics. To be ethical while considering all animals to be machines, because somebody in high school told me so, that's just very superficial. There needs to be a new understanding of the metaphysics and cosmology of nature. And finally, concern with the environment has to become a central concern of Muslims. I know only 2 or 3 of the great ulama of Islam who had official functions who were aware of this, like the late Sheikh Ahmed Keftaru, the Grand Mufti of Syria, rahmatullah alayh, who was a remarkable man, very remarkable man. And there are some others, Sheikh Ali Joma, the Grand Mufti of Egypt. I'm not saying there is none. There are a few people in Iran, 1 or 2 people in Pakistan. I don't want to name everybody now. But for most of our ulama, this is not even part of the discussion. The government orders them to talk about ethics on Fridays in order not to talk about political things. It's easy to say not to steal money from your neighbor. Oh, alhamdulillah, that's very good. But we need people to preach to the vast majority of Muslims about the religious duty of Muslims towards the environment. It's our duty towards God. It's our duty towards ourselves. It's our duty to our children and grandchildren. We all want to have our lovely grandchildren running around, live. But we live in such a way as if there were to be no world for them to live in. I will conclude by saying that I pray for all of you. The little that we do, each one of us does, even the 20,000 people here, the little step taken is a great deal. We need to awaken the Islamic world to its great treasures, to awaken them to their duty towards the world of nature, awaken them to the spiritual significance of nature. And I guarantee you, God has created the world in such a way that nature will have the last word. Thank you.